22 minutes is the exact duration of my drive. I have clocked it with obsessive precision every 3 months since a heart scare forced me onto blood thinners, turning my life into a series of monitored routines. I know every click of my signal as I pull on to Crestwood Lane, but that Tuesday, a note was wedged under my wiper. The ink was pressed hard into the paper. Don't go inside. Come to my house first. I have something you need to see. Marcus. In that moment, would you choose to walk into the home you've shared for 31 years and pretend nothing was wrong? Or would you turn the car around to face a truth capable of shattering everything you ever believed? Marcus didn't say hello. He was 71, a retired postal inspector who had spent 40 years looking for the things people tried to hide in plain sight. He lived alone in a house that always smelled of cedar and strong black coffee. He gestured for me to sit on the sofa and placed a laptop on the coffee table. I sat, feeling the familiar hollow skip of my heart, but I kept my hands still. A man who builds bridges for a living knows that panic is just another form of structural failure. I wasn't looking for this, Marcus said, his voice as dry as old wood. He explained that he'd installed the high-definition cameras after the package thefts on our street last spring. He hit play. The timestamp on the screen read 2 weeks ago, a Thursday at 11:14 in the morning. That was exactly when I was supposed to be at my woodworking class at the community centre. I have gone every Thursday for 2 years. It keeps my hands busy now that I no longer have a firm to run. The footage was clear. A grey sedan pulled up to the curb of my driveway. The driver stayed inside. My front door opened, the same door Heather had picked out in 1993 because she thought red looked welcoming. She walked out, followed by a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his early 50s, wearing an expensive button-down shirt. They stood on my porch for 5 minutes, speaking with the quiet, leaning intimacy of people who had shared many secrets. Heather handed him a thick, professional-looking leather portfolio. He gave a sharp, formal nod, tucked it under his arm as if finishing a routine, closing, and walked back to the car. Marcus showed me 3 more clips from the previous 6 weeks. It was always on a Thursday. It was always during my class. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is to become a silent investor in a version of family that no longer exists. We stop inspecting the foundation because we're too busy admiring the paint. I asked who the man was. Marcus slid a business card across the table. Hartfield and Greer, estate planning. The man was a senior associate. My wife and I had finalized our estate plans 20 years ago with a firm downtown. We hadn't discussed changes. I hadn't authorized any meetings. In my profession, we say that a bridge doesn't collapse because of a single heavy load. It collapses because the internal supports have been corroded by a slow, invisible leak. I had spent 38 years ensuring that the structures I built would hold. Now, sitting in my neighbor's living room, I realized that while I was out inspecting the world's bridges, someone had been quietly digging out the earth from beneath my own home. Marcus looked at me and asked if I wanted to see the court filing his daughter had found. The kitchen smelled like rosemary chicken when I walked in. It was a Tuesday ritual, a sensory anchor designed to project stability while the foundation was being hollowed out. Heather kissed me on the cheek, her eyes lingering just a second too long, searching for a confusion that wasn't there. She asked how my cardiologist appointment went. I told her the doctor said everything was fine, which was factually accurate, and I sat at the table to watch her move. I observed the way she handled the silver efficient and detached the same way she was apparently handling the liquidation of our 31-year partnership. Looking back now, I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I had been the silent investor in her version of family for decades, footing the bill for a lifestyle she felt entitled to simply by proximity. To Heather, I wasn't a man anymore. I was a depreciating asset. In the world of an aging professional, your value often shifts from what you can build to what you have already accumulated. Once she realized I was no longer interested in building more, she decided it was time to manage the portfolio. She viewed my autonomy as a liability that needed to be mitigated before the maintenance costs of my health grew too high. "Nathan, did you remember to call the insurance agent today?" she asked, her voice dipping into a practiced maternal register. "I did," I said. I hadn't. I wanted to see if she would use the lie against me. "That's strange, honey." I checked the house phone records while I was looking for the pharmacy number, and I didn't see any outgoing calls. Are you sure you didn't just think you did it? She tilted her head, offering a thin, brittle smile. This was the moment I felt the narcissistic injury, the calculated effort to manufacture evidence of my decline. It was clinical, really. If she could make me doubt my own internal structural integrity, she wouldn't even have to fight me. I would just hand over the keys. The phone rang shortly after dinner. It was Tyler, calling from Atlanta. His tone had shifted in the last year to something patronizing, a subscription to a brand of concern that I was the only one paying for. He asked if I was managing the stress, and mentioned that Mom had told him I seemed a bit disoriented lately. He suggested it might be time for me to step back and let him handle the estate. If I'm being honest, I felt a flash of something hotter than anger. I felt the sharp, cold need for an accurate accounting of our lives. I ate her chicken, I asked about her book club, and I slept in our bed without letting my expression change a single degree. I was an engineer. I knew how to wait for the concrete to set. The next morning, as soon as her car cleared the driveway, I went to her desk. I didn't have to look for long. Tucked inside a folder of mundane household bills was the document Marcus had warned me about. It was a formal petition to the court, supported by a signed affidavit to have me declared legally incapacitated. The signature at the bottom was my son's. I met Patricia at her office downtown the next morning. She has been my personal attorney for 20 years, the woman who handled my father's probate and the sale of my engineering practice. I trusted her with the same certainty. I trusted the laws of physics. She didn't offer me tea or platitudes. She offered me a ledger. What she found was a methodical, patient dismantling of my life's work. Over the course of 14 months, our joint trust had been bled of exactly $500,000. The transfers were cleverly disguised as recurring consulting fees and property maintenance for a shell LLC I had never heard of. It was a termite infestation of the soul, hidden behind the mundane language of business. If you didn't look at the cumulative sum, you wouldn't notice the wood was turning to dust. Heather hadn't just been hoarding the cash. She had been quietly buying her way into a high-stakes urban renewal project led by Julian Vane, my oldest professional rival. It was a calculated move to secure her own legacy, ensuring that when I was erased, she would remain a power player in the Savannah architectural community by his side. Looking back now, I realized that money is merely a shell. The betrayal of trust is what causes the structure to fail entirely. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and I realized then that compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. The incapacity petition was the master key she needed to unlock the rest. Without it, my signature was still required for the larger asset liquidations. With it, I was effectively erased while still breathing. I sat across from Patricia, and for the first time in my life, I felt the cold weight of being a victim. But a structural engineer doesn't collapse under pressure. We redistribute the load. On Patricia's advice, I installed 3 covert cameras of my own. I placed one in the home office, one in the hallway near the filing cabinet, and one in the garage. I understood systems. I understood the value of documentation. On a Wednesday evening, while I pretended to watch the game, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I watched the screen as my wife opened the filing cabinet and began photographing my confidential medical files with her phone. Marcus's daughter at the courthouse called him that night with the final piece of the timeline. An emergency hearing for the incapacity petition had been fast-tracked and officially set for just 12 days out, fueled by her fabricated claims of my rapidly deteriorating mental safety. I went back to Patricia and laid every new file on the table, the camera footage, the transfer records, and the copy of the petition with my son's signature. Patricia looked at me, her eyes as sharp as a scalpel. She said, "Nathan, the evidence is now undeniable. We are ready to respond." The signature was the only thing that felt heavy. I stood in my workshop that night, the light from the single bulb overhead casting long, distorted shadows across the workbench. I had a copy of the petition in my hands. The paper felt brittle, like old blueprints left in the sun for too long. I turned to the final page, the affidavit. There, in black ink, was the signature of my only son, Tyler. He had officially sworn to a court of law that I was a man who no longer knew his own mind. Looking back now, that signature was a structural failure I hadn't accounted for. I had designed bridges to withstand hurricanes and earthquakes, but I hadn't built a defense against a son who would trade his father's dignity for a faster inheritance. If I'm being honest, I felt a silence so profound it was almost deafening. It wasn't the $500,000 Heather had moved. It was the fact that they were trying to evict me from the reality of my own life. I sat on my stool and picked up a hand plane, running it over a block of white oak. The thin curls of wood fell away like dead skin. At the time, I didn't realize that my silence over the last few weeks, my willingness to eat that rosemary chicken and smile through the lies, wasn't resignation. It was survival. This was the invisible chain of the survivor. People often mistake a victim's silence for weakness or acceptance. In reality, it is a form of learned helplessness that has been repurposed into a tactical advantage. I was existing in a house without bars, a prison created by 31 years of shared history. My silence allowed me to stay inside the system long enough to map every crack and every rotting timber. I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was waiting for the concrete to set on their own crimes. I called Patricia that night. I didn't raise my voice. I just told her to file the response. She had prepared a 47-page counter petition. It wasn't just a denial. It was a full forensic audit of Heather's movements. The video from Marcus's driveway, the photos of her at the filing cabinet, and the history of the transfers to my rival's firm. Send it to Tyler too, I told her. He needs to see the blueprints of the house he's helping to burn down. Patricia sent a digital copy to his Atlanta office and a hard copy via overnight courier. We had 12 days until the hearing. 12 days for the truth to travel across state lines and settle into the mind of a son who had been fed a diet of poison stories for 2 years. I went back into the house. Heather was in the living room, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand and her iPad in the other, probably looking at vacation rentals in Tuscany. I didn't say a word. I just went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and watched the clock. The countdown had begun, but the most dangerous part of a structural collapse is the moment right before the first girder gives way. My phone rang at 4:17 p.m. on Friday. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I was sitting on the back porch steps, the same steps I had spent 31 years maintaining. I had finally finished stripping the old, peeling paint, exposing the raw wood beneath. I didn't say hello. I just waited. The silence stretched across the 300 miles between us until it was broken by a sound I had not heard in 2 decades. My son was sobbing. It was a jagged, visceral sound that made my own chest feel like a bridge reaching its load limit. "Dad," he choked out. That single word carried more weight than the 47-page counter petition Patricia had overnighted to his office. He had spent the last hour reading the forensic audit of his mother's spending. He had seen the undeniable digital trail of $500,000, the very funds he believed she was securing for his future, vanishing into the accounts of a firm linked to my professional enemy. He realized then that he wasn't her partner. He was her collateral. He had read the transcript of her meetings with the estate attorney while I was supposedly losing my mind at woodworking class. He told me everything Heather had fed him. She had used the pauses between their Sunday calls to plant seeds of doubt. She told him I was wandering the neighborhood at night. She told him I had accused her of hiding my keys when I had simply misplaced them. She built a case for my decline so gradually that he did not realize he was being drafted into her legal army. Looking back now, I understand that truth has a specific gravity. It is heavy, silent, and inevitable. Once it is released, it does not need to be pushed. It simply falls, crushing the fragile webs of deception that were never designed to hold its weight. She told me, "You were losing the estate," Tyler whispered. She said you were making erratic investments that would bankrupt us all. I did not offer him the comfort he wanted. I did not tell him it was okay. I told him I was not angry, which was a strategic truth. Anger is a high-maintenance emotion, and I was no longer willing to pay the overhead for a version of family that was built on a hollow foundation. I told him he needed to fly to Savannah. He arrived 2 days later. We did not sit in the living room with the rosemary chicken and the Chardonnay. I took him to the workshop. I showed him the raw data. I let him watch the footage from Marcus's camera. His mother handed over the envelopes with the practiced ease of a business transaction. I watched his face shift from denial to a cold, hard realization. At that moment, I was not just his father. I was the architect showing him the rot in the load-bearing walls. Heather came home an hour later. She saw Tyler's car in the driveway, and her face lit up with a triumphal glow she could not quite mask. She thought her reinforcement had arrived for the hearing. She did not know that the signature she had spent months procuring was about to become the instrument of her own social and legal foreclosure. The hearing was in 48 hours. The lines were drawn, but the map of the battlefield had changed completely. The air in the courtroom was artificially cold. Heather sat 2 tables to my left, wearing a string of pearls and an expression of quiet, practiced concern. She looked every bit the devoted wife of a man whose mind was supposed to be failing. Her attorney, the man from the grey sedan, spoke to the judge with a tone of rehearsed sadness. He described me as a once brilliant engineer who was now a danger to his own legacy. It was a polished performance, designed to make the judge feel like declaring me incapacitated was an act of mercy rather than a liquidation. Looking back now, I realize that truth has a specific gravity. It doesn't need to shout to be felt. When it finally falls, it crushes the most elaborate webs of deception without effort. Patricia, my attorney, didn't interrupt their opening statement. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the black leather binder that contained the blueprints of Heather's undoing. Then they called my son to the stand. Tyler walked past his mother without a glance. He took the oath with a firmness that reminded me of my father. When Heather's attorney asked him to confirm the episodes of confusion he had described in his affidavit, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I cannot confirm them," Tyler said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room, "because they never happened. My mother fed me those stories over the course of 2 years. She used my distance and my concern for my father to manufacture a crisis that did not exist. I signed that affidavit under false pretenses, and I am here to recount it in its entirety." The shift in the room was physical. It was the sound of a support beam snapping under a load it was never meant to carry. Heather's face didn't crumble into tears. It hardened into a mask of pure clinical calculation. She looked at our son not as a child she loved, but as a business partner who had just breached a contract. Patricia stood up then. She didn't rely on emotion. She presented the bank records, the 14 months of termite transfers that had drained exactly $500,000 from our shared life. She submitted the time-stamped video of Heather photographing my confidential files. She pointed to the associate sitting at the next table and detailed the new trust documents he had prepared to transfer the Savannah estate into Heather's name alone. The judge dismissed the incapacity petition before lunch. It wasn't the dramatic victory you see in movies. It was a cold, procedural erasure of a lie. The court referred the evidence of the $500,000 theft to the state attorney's office for elder financial exploitation. My wife was not handcuffed in the room. Real life is quieter than that, but the formal referral for a criminal investigation was processed and flagged for the district attorney before the courtroom doors had even swung shut behind her. Heather eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of financial exploitation. The sentence was 3 years of probation and a court order to return every cent of the $500,000 she had diverted. In a city like Savannah, the loss of her reputation was the heavier burden. The charity boards and garden clubs she cherished closed their doors to her overnight. She had tried to declare me legally invisible, but in the end, she was the one who was erased from the life she had built on my back. I walked out of the courthouse and looked at the sky. It was grey and indifferent, much like the law. But for the first time in 31 years, the structural integrity of my life was no longer in question. I painted the red door navy blue in March. It was a small change, but in a city like Savannah, where history is written in the pigment of the shutters, it was a declaration. The divorce had been finalized on a cold Tuesday in February. It took the state attorney's office nearly 4 months to complete their forensic accounting, but in the end, every cent of the $500,000 was returned to the trust. Patricia had been clinical throughout the process, ensuring that the return of funds was handled with the same precision I used to calculate the load on a suspension cable. I did not sell the Savannah estate. Heather had spent years treating the property like a stage for her social performances, but the land belonged to my family's history. Instead of leaving the rooms empty, I converted the carriage house and the west wing into a workshop and a design studio. I established the Savannah Restoration School. We take in 12 students every year, young people who have been overlooked by traditional systems, people who have the hands for craft but lacked the foundation to start. I teach them that a structure is only as good as the integrity of its joints. If the wood is sound and the joinery is honest, it will hold for 100 years. Tyler calls every Sunday at 4 p.m. now. We no longer talk about the incapacity petition or the months we lost to his mother's poisoned narratives. We are building something new, carefully, on ground that has been tested by the weight of a massive betrayal. Last month, he drove up from Atlanta and we spent the entire Saturday on the back porch. We didn't talk much, we just worked. We finally stripped and refinished the steps I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. As the sun set, he looked at the clear sealant drying on the oak and said it looked solid. I told him it would hold. Marcus still joins me for coffee on Friday mornings. At Christmas, I brought him a bottle of 20-year-old bourbon. He tried to refuse, saying he only did what any neighbor would do. I told him that, in my experience, most neighbors would have minded their own business while my house was being gutted from the inside. He just smiled, poured 2 fingers of the bourbon, and said that a man who has spent 40 years looking for fraud never stops checking the seals. Looking back now, I realized that for a long time, I was the silent investor in a version of family that had stopped paying dividends years ago. I had been footing the bill for a subscription to a life where I was the only one honoring the contract. It took the threat of my own erasure to make me see that compassion is a luxury that some people simply do not deserve. This is for those of you who find yourselves living on the edge of your own family's narrative. You might feel a crushing weight of obligation to people who see you only as a utility or a source of capital. I want you to know that blood is not a binding contract for quiet exploitation. You are not a bird. But if I have learned anything from 31 years of a red door and a navy blue ending, it is that truth is the only foundation worth building on. Sometimes the most constructive act an architect can perform is a controlled demolition of a toxic history. It is painful to watch the walls come down, but it is the only way to see the ground for what it actually is. I still go to woodworking on Thursdays. I am making an oak bookcase for the school's library. My instructor, a woman who understands that the soul of a piece is found in the direction of the grain, asked me if I missed the red door. I told her that red was the color of a welcome I was trying too hard to earn. Navy blue is the color of the deep water, steady, calm, and entirely its own. My son's voice on Sunday is real. The joints in this oak are real. The steps are solid. And for the first time in a very long time, I am not waiting for something to fail. Have you ever had to dismantle a part of your life to build a more honest future? If this story resonated with you, I would really like to hear your perspective.